Hello, happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of Practice. This show is an unrehearsed screen recording of my workflow in Cinema 4D and other digital art applications. I'm Stuart. I'm a 3D artist, illustrator, sometimes animator and designer, and your pal. And I'm excited, just like every week, to have everyone back and, coming to the table and taking this opportunity to improve their skills and have a little fun while they're doing it. So this week, I'm going back to one of my favorite subject matters, which is landscapes. And this one in particular was inspired by an amazing weekend trip I had to Big Sur, California, which some of you may know is sort of a region in the central coast of California that just has the most dramatic cliffs that fall off into the Pacific Ocean. And the views are spectacular. And I had the very distinct pleasure to watch the sunset over the coast and was just blown away by the scale and the grandeur of these cliffs that fall off into really rather inaccessible beaches and lead into the largest body of water in the world, which is the Pacific Ocean. And so this week we're taking a fairly simple approach. I'd almost call this low poly. We're taking a low poly approach to creating this coastline and the cliffs there. And so as you can see, we're already part of the way in, and we're dropping in the water here using a landscape with just a little bit of height on it. We've taken a whole bunch of really pointy, very sheer cliff faces, and we're making those with just cubes that we've altered the angle on a little bit. And one thing you'll notice when you're looking at huge rock formations is that very frequently they have similar angles and the forms repeat. So I find it useful to take when I'm doing cliffs like this or rock faces like this, to take a single shape and really just repeat that angle over and over again. And that's what we're doing here. We're using really, this entire scene is created with cubes, landscapes, and just a handful of capsules, because wouldn't be one of my pieces without a capsule. So here we are, and of course we're using the physical sky object as our light source, which, if you're doing an outdoor landscape kind of scene, I really think that's an awesome way to achieve somewhat realistic and beautiful effects. You can see here we're playing with the timing and we're playing with the rotation. Normally I don't worry too much about being realistic with location and light sources, but of course the Big Sur faces the Pacific Ocean, which is on the west coast of California, and the sun sets over the Pacific, and I wanted to capture that accurately. And normally I like to really have dramatic shadows in a piece like this, but couldn't quite achieve that just based on the direction things were pointing in. But I wanted to maintain a little bit of realism and getting that light source coming from the right angle. So we're pecking away at this, just doing test renderings, adjusting that angle, getting stuff just right. And another thing that I'll spend a lot of time kind of dialing in on this episode is the fog. The physical sky object has a little button you can press that turns on fog. And the mist and the moisture in the air is really quite noticeable in Big Sur, and you can see sort of the depth of the range and the cliffs as they sort of disappear into the misty surf. And I wanted to capture that, and I wanted to create a sense of depth or atmospheric perspective with how these rock faces would recede into the horizon. And now it's fairly arid, and there's not a ton of plant life, but what plant life there is sort of scrubby and shrubby and low-lying and kind of, you're not going to run into big trees and tons of like lush flowering plants. So a lot of times with a scene like this, I'll go crazy with the trees and the plants and the little details like that. But really, I'm focusing mostly on these rock formations, knowing that Big Sur's got a fairly minimal plant landscape. And I think, given more time, if this were a full-length piece and not one of my practices, I probably would have spent a little bit more time getting variation in there. Even though the plant life is fairly sparse and low-lying, there's some really crazy kind of lichens that you get all these colors from. And there's, I'm not a botanist. I don't know all the different species, but suffice it to say, there is a range of colors and textures that you can get there. So you see here, I'm just using a capsule, a little bit of green on it to, to take a nod to some of that plant life, to simulate it a little bit. You're adjusting that fog. I find that with the fog object, the fog tab under the physical sky object, that there's there's a little point under this density area, and I find that it's useful to have the tip of that point be around the point where your floor is. Now, I adjusted that to 0 because this plane I have that's acting as the ocean is at around 0. And that's going to be like that. The top of that point there is going to be the most dense area of the fog, and it's going to fall off on either direction. So what I want is the densest part of the fog to be around the horizon line, and I want it to sort of fall off gradually upwards from there. And we wind up not really seeing much of the downwards fall off. Another thing you typically have to adjust is the distance. It gets really kind of noticeable and fake looking if it extends too far past where the sort of the natural end of your model is. You can really see an overly strong gradient. So you got to adjust that distance until it has a more natural look. What I love is the way that your model will appear to recede into the distance when you have that fog going on it. It's a lovely effect. Another amazing thing about this region of California is the color of the earth is very reddish orange. I assume it's high in iron content, and it's just striking, very, very striking. And I'm starting here with sort of a browny orange. I think we go a little bit more orange and saturated as the episode goes on. And when we get into post-processing in Photoshop, I push that a whole bunch further too, because I realize that the scene could benefit from a little more saturation, a little bit more of that orange, and that's also going to give us a more realistic and a more saturated sort of sunset view. I also adjusted the angle. The composition wasn't quite working for me yet, so I made sure to adjust accordingly and get a little bit of a better view, a little bit more of a better angle on the cliffs and coastline here. What I'm doing is I'm just taking a bit of that geometry from the edge and creating some sort of waves rolling into shore. It's a little bit of a clumsy process, if I'm honest. This isn't something I've done before. A lot of times I just use like sort of a formula effector, and I'd use that to create sort of a rippled effect, but I wanted this to be really simple and kind of graphic. So I just created an additional piece of geometry and made it a lighter blue color than the rest of the ocean to sort of simulate some of these waves rolling in and breaking. So another amazing thing about the coastline here is that the water is very, very rough. And you'll see, there's tons of life. There's tons of seals and kelp beds and, of course, sharks and all kinds of stuff, tons of birds. But the water's rough and can be dangerous. So I wanted to get a little bit of those waves coming in. So you'll see here, I just copy and pasted a chunk of that coastline out of the landscape that is making our ocean here. That's just sort of a few of them, and I took it perhaps a little bit too far. You'll see here I added another landscape, and I'm trying to add another layer of interest to the water here. And I play with that a little bit, do a test rendering or two, and find that I think ultimately it's taking away from the cliffs. It isn't really the right look for what I'm trying to achieve. And so we give it a try here for a little while, but I wind up deleting that. think it's interesting, a lot of times we're afraid to remove stuff that we've already spent some time on, that we've worked on. It sort of reminds me of something called the sunk cost fallacy, which is the idea that like people are hesitant to abandon a project or a piece of artwork or something like that if it's not working because they've spent a lot of time with it already. And they're like, oh, I've already, a lot of times you hear about it in the investment world. Like, I've already dumped so much money into this company and so much time into this company. But if you don't have the customers and if it's not working, you'll still need to abandon it at one point. And you can reach this point where you wind up sinking way more resources into the thing than needs to be just to make something work, to try and preserve something that ultimately doesn't belong anyway. So I think that applies to artwork, and I think especially in the digital medium, in digital mediums, I should say, it's amazing because you can just sort of turn things off or hide a layer or undo. So don't be afraid to remove stuff that isn't working. Make changes. If you're not loving where you're at, hit that delete key. So here we go, I'm adjusting, going a little more orange, adding a little bit of bump to these rocks because even though they're low poly and simple and graphic and very cool in that way, I felt that they needed a little bit more texture. So I've added some noise into the diffuse layer. I've added a bit of bump to some of these materials here. Adjusting color. Another thing I thought would be interesting, and I don't do this a lot, I usually stick to either a square format or a 16:9 HD format, but I thought for this composition in particular and the very long and dramatic view of the landscape in Big Sur, I thought it would be interesting to try a really long format image here. So I go ahead and make it a super wide format image. And I think it creates a pretty dramatic look, a pretty dynamic look, and I think that helps extenuate this idea of a coastline. Because when you look out onto the ocean or a large body of water, it's very horizontal. You're smacked right in the face with that horizon line, and things feel very long and wide. And I wanted to try and accomplish that effect in this piece, and I think it worked. Another thing I felt like that maybe just needed a little bit of interest, and because the coastline is so rocky in the central coast of California, there's tons of these little sort of rock islands out to shore. So I wanted to add one of those in as well. So I used a little landscape for that. And I also used a much shorter version of the same landscape just beneath it to create sort of some water lapping up against the edges of that rock. Adjusting the plateau level and tweaking it here and there. It's not a perfect effect, but this is sort of a minor piece of the composition and seemed to work for our purposes. Adjusting the color of the water here, I felt like the blue wasn't deep enough. Went ahead and darken that. I also added a little bit of a gradient because as the ocean gets deeper, it tends to get darker. So I had sort of a gradient added here, which will make the water appear darker as it goes off to the left and to the horizon. I wasn't liking the edge of some of these faces. We were getting sort of a weird bit of geometry and shading there. So I simplified some of those, which I think helped. you build up some really interesting visual rhythms using these repeated shapes and selectively showing, larger and smaller chunks of them. You want to have areas that are bigger and flatter and other areas that are thinner and more repetitive, and that helps you, achieve rhythm. Just like in a piece of music, there often are quiet spots and slower spots, or and it depends on the type of music or the type of art you want to create. Some has a constant driving rhythm, and that creates one effect. The other has variation and things change over the course of the piece, which gives you another effect. And so with this one, I wanted to have some areas of flat, fairly simple regions, and then some more complicated, detailed, pointier regions, more little crevices and cracks and edges to the rocks here. So I think the other thing that's nice is the very angular edges of these cliffs are complemented nicely by the sort of rolling, rounded hills. They contrast each other. And so here I dialed that fog way the heck up. I think I went a little too far, actually, so we take that down a little bit more. And we're getting close here, so we're just sort of fine-tuning a handful of little things, bringing us into that final rendering or two. I felt like those cliffs were working a lot better after I had reduced some of the polygons and changed sort of the angle of some of the facets that were facing the camera. I was feeling pretty good about it here. I think it was appropriately hazy, felt like a coastline, had some nice depth to it. And so I saved out a copy and brought it into Photoshop, pushed a little more orange and red into the highlights so that those cliff faces would really pop from their background. And of course, I always love to put a little bit of blue into the shading and the darker regions, which creates a nice effect. Bumping up the saturation here a little bit of extra lightness. It might be a little bit difficult to see over the stream, but I go ahead and add in a little bit of noise, just to add a little bit of extra graininess to the piece. So a little bit maybe sterile, or a little bit lacking a little bit of detail, and I think adding a bit of noise can help there. And I felt like maybe the sunlight effect, the sunset effect, wasn't quite dramatic enough. So my last step here really is adding some bold orange overlays that give it that super warm sunset kind of feel. And there you have it. If you like this video, please hit like and subscribe. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to drop one in the comments below. If you want to keep up with me and the work that I'm doing, please check me out on Instagram at DLGNCE. And until next week, this is Stuart saying goodbye. Thanks.